Welcome back everyone to another video on the Vixen Victory channel. Today we're going to be talking about Hu Tao, one of the other characters that we see on the banners here, on the second half of the banner basically. Looking at her as a character, let's go ahead and talk about first and foremost looking at her actual talents, and then we'll go ahead and look at how you should actually be building her. So first and foremost, looking at how she's actually supposed to be built. In terms of leveling priority when looking at your talents, technically you should be leveling into all three of these pretty evenly. Now, I stopped caring about my Hu Tao a very long time ago. I got her pretty early and technically by accident, back during the Yelan and Hu Tao banner, but basically, in a very broad sense, don't look at what I'm doing here. Technically, you don't need to level the burst. It is a good idea to do so. The reason why is because the burst does do a big damage hit as well as a lot of extra healing, which is probably actually very good for you. But if you're playing Hu Tao correctly, especially with a shielder, you probably won't be using this very often because you don't want to really go too above and beyond your normal healing. So normally you don't want to go too high in your HP, therefore messing you up. So the only time you would really ever use your burst is for a big damage hit as well as to make sure that you are not going to die. I will say though, with that being said, the burst is still a very good thing to level into, once again, because of the HP regeneration that you can get from it. But I would say once again that the whole idea though for her is to stay at lower HP. Looking at her normal attacks, the normal attack talent, you should be leveling into this because the major way that she's going to be doing her damage is through her charged attacks. You should be leveling into this skill because you are going to be getting, based off of and using her skill, you're going to turn your HP into attack, which is going to allow her to then do more damage. Also, by doing so, you're going to increase some Blood Blossom damage, but honestly, that's not really that useful. What you really care about is making sure you're getting as much attack increase from your max HP. So, leveling into your skill and your normal attack talent are probably the higher priority, with the burst being at the end, and that's basically what it's staying here. So, if you're going to look at these two and then the burst at the end. Overall, with looking at how she actually works, as you can see, there's nothing new or special about her normal charge attack or plunging attacks initially, but when we look at her skill, you can see that there's a little bit of a difference here that's going to change that. It states that when you use your skill, Hu Tao is going to consume a set portion of her HP to knock the surrounding enemies back and enter the Paramita Papilio state. Now, when she's in this state, it will increase Hu Tao's attack based on her max HP at the time of entering the state. The attack bonus she gains will be gained this way that cannot exceed Hu Tao's base attack by 400%. So if you have a base attack with Hu Tao of, let's say you have a huge buff based off of HP, it's basically just putting a cap on that. So the attack buff that you can get can't be higher for me. It wouldn't be higher than just over 2,800 for the attack increase based on my max HP. That, once again, that is mainly because the double hydro now as well. Now, when she was a more of a earlier character, I don't think there was a crazy way to really get that much attack, although it can be very close. But I think especially now with the HP increase that you can get from double hydro, that definitely can become a lot more kind of usable. A lot of people probably back then were trying to go for a hydro or an HP percent goblet to maybe just max it out if they could have. I think that probably would have been the play, but since there is a max on it, it's best to probably just to build her a little bit differently. When we look at this though, you convert your attack damage into pyro damage. Basically you get a pyro infusion, can't be overridden by any other pyro infusions, can't be overridden by any other elemental infusion. Your charge attacks will apply the Blood Blossom effect to enemies that are hit and will increase Hu Tao's resistance to interruption. That all happens in this state that she puts herself in as soon as you press your skill. Looking at the Blood Blossom effect though, basically it's pretty standard. There's nothing crazy that actually comes out of it, because honestly it's just basically some extra pyro damage every 4 seconds. It is elemental skill damage, so the damage is based off of the level from this skill as well as any buffs that come to skill damage. But once again, you don't really care too much about that. If you're actually going to be, going for Hu Tao, the major thing you're going to be going for support characters, if they are going to be buffing it, is going to be charge attack damage. Also, when you're in this state, it will end when its duration is over or when Hu Tao has left the battlefield or she has fallen or died. So basically, the idea here is with her, immediately tapping her skill. So as soon as you get into her skill, and then immediately doing charge attacks to then give yourself a bigger damage hit as well as to do a little bit more with what you're actually going to be getting from her. Now, you notice it is very easy to get rid of that, and as you saw, eventually over time, your skill is just going to get rid of the pyro infusion that you have on her. So keep that in mind. You do have with the skill a duration of 9 seconds, so you'll have a downtime of about 7 seconds. Once again, keep that in mind as you are trying and using Hu Tao. Now also remember and see that I lost about 30% of my HP, and it will happen again a little bit more. So as soon as it happens again, there's a little bit more time period that you're in this skill state, but that doesn't mean that when you're in this state, you are going to be losing more HP. Looking at the first passive talent, when basically after you use or you're done with the state in your skill, so as soon as you're done in that little state that she gives after that 9-second duration, all other characters will have their crit rate increased by 12% for 8 seconds. It kind of just helps your supports or other characters to, as they're getting ready to set up for the next rotation for Hu Tao, it allows them to do a little bit more damage and crit a little bit more easy, maybe also allow for some more particle creation for them. Basically, if they have like a Favonius or something like that, that might help them a little bit more. Get more damage out, as well as possibly help some other characters if they are running Fav to get particles for themselves to allow themselves to get ready for the next rotation using all their bursts and whatnot. Looking at the second passive talent, it states that when Hu Tao's HP is equal to or less than 50%, her pyro damage bonus is increased by 33%. Once again, we're seeing here that the lower your HP is, the better. So with the skill decreasing your HP, now you can see that you're easily losing a buff here if your HP is over 50%. So making sure that you're keeping your HP low is the whole idea. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and go back to the burst. Basically, you're going to do a huge AoE pyro damage hit, and you're going to regenerate some HP based on your max HP. This can effectively be triggered up to 5 times, so it's based on the enemies that you actually hit. If Hu Tao's HP is below or equal to 50% of when the enemy is hit, both the damage and HP regeneration are then increased. So you can hit up to 5 enemies at one time, but if you have a lower HP, you're going to do a bigger damage hit, and if you are a lower HP, you're going to get more, basically more healing from it as well. Now, this also does have a very low energy cost, which is the whole reason why it's pretty good for Hu Tao, because usually you're running her with other characters that are not pyro. Possibly you will be, but mainly you're running her with like a double hydro team or something like that. So usually getting some other characters that are going to be very helpful for this is going to be kind of her major way to do a lot of damage. Also, that's kind of the idea when we're looking at Hu Tao with all of her passive talents. Once again, with the talents though, looking into your skill and your normal attack with your burst at the end, and obviously make sure at the end of the day to make sure you're keeping your HP lower than 50%. Now let's go ahead and talk about some weapons. Obviously, her best in slot weapon is going to be Staff of Homa. This is honestly one of the best polearms in the game, if I'm being honest with you. Never mind the HP increase. Also, it provides an attack bonus based on your HP, and then if you're less than 50%, you'll get an additional 1% on the basically the bonus that you already get as well. So instead of it being 0.8%, it'll be 1.8% if you're lower than 50% HP. Another reason for her to be lower than 50% HP while she's doing her damage. The major idea here to focus on all with Hu Tao is that a lot of people think that she's an HP scaler. Now, although she has a very high amount of HP, that's once again not how she does damage. If you look at her attacks in here, you see that even her charge attacks, her normal attacks, whatever, is all going to be based off of attack percent because it doesn't say HP percent here. You're turning your HP into attack. So although you are focusing into getting HP, and you should be with your, talents or your artifacts and whatnot, going into HP percent here and there, the idea isn't to focus solely into, looking forward to only HP percent. HP percent should be your main focus, but if you get an attack percent substat here or there, don't necessarily cry about it because it's actually not that bad. It's not a useless stat to actually go for. Now, looking at the rest of the other weapons that you could use for Hu Tao, there are some other weapons and there are some other pretty good polearms that can be used for her. Looking in terms of other 5-stars, things like Primordial Jade-Wing Spear. Although it does have a lower crit rate, it does have a higher base attack, which allows you to obviously have more base attack or more attack when you're actually doing your damage. Also, as you hit things, the more you hit things, the higher your attack is going to be. So it's allowing Hu Tao to be a little bit stronger over time and allows her to steadily increase as she gets farther into her damage phases, meaning the numbers are going to be bigger and bigger the longer she's in her state. Now, with her ascending into crit damage as well, this is also a pretty good weapon to go into because it's going into crit rate. She ascends into crit damage. It kind of just balances some things out kind of here and there. Now, another weapon that can be pretty good as well is Staff of the Scarlet Sands. This weapon is Cyno's weapon, and this weapon has 44% crit rate at level 90. Very, very good. It's a very high amount of crit rate for a polearm, especially a 5-star at level 90. So it's very, very good. But the thing is to focus here is that you're basically getting some extra attack based off your elemental mastery. Now, with Hu Tao, you're mainly putting her in a lot of vaporize teams. So yes, a little bit of elemental mastery is going to be helpful and useful. but it's not necessarily supposed to be the biggest thing in the world that you're supposed to go for. So getting yourself to maybe 100 is probably a good idea if you're actually building her fully. Then getting her to about 100 EM should be good. Just make sure you don't suffer any of your crit or anything like that when you're actually building her as well, or your HP to get to that EM. EM is kind of the last stat to go for. But if you are running Staff of the Scarlet Sands, if you have some, almost too much EM, or if you're trying to build her that way, that will lend yourself to getting some more attack because of it. Because of the resurgence of like newer characters like Sino, as well as even newer characters, someone more recent, Emily, more weapons have been a little bit more useful for characters like Hu Tao. Lumidosh Elegy, Emily's weapon, is actually pretty good for her as well. You get an attack increase, and technically it does help if you have a Dendro character on here, because that will help a little bit more with burning. If you have some sort of burning team that has a little bit of hydro in there for application, that could be useful, but once again, you're not focusing on then Hu Tao to actually be doing the vaporizing, you're focusing on the hydro character to do the vaporizing. So it's not really the way to go, in my personal opinion, but technically this weapon could even still be a good stat stick either way, just because of it is a 5-star. So if you accidentally have either Sino or Lumidosh Elegy, they are pretty good weapons, or Staff of the Scarlet Sands or Lumidosh Elegy, they are pretty good weapons to go for and use if you want to for your Hu Tao. Now, there are some other weapons when we look at 4-stars that can actually be pretty useful. A pretty good weapon that especially can be useful for Hu Tao, because once again you're going into a little bit of that EM, can be the 4-star Battle Pass weapon, Battle of the Fjords. When there are at least 3 elemental types in the party, elemental mastery will be increased by 120. Usually you have someone like a shielder of a different element, so maybe Layla or Zhongli or something like that, and then hydro characters, and then Hu Tao being a pyro character. That is 3 different elemental types in a party, allowing Hu Tao to get this elemental mastery increase, which already allows you to not have to worry about EM when you're looking at your other pieces, but it will also make sure that your vaporizers are going to do more damage. Now, when we look at having another character like that, that can be a little bit annoying, but it is pretty good to think about and go for. Another weapon that can be useful talking about EM is something like Dragon's Bane. This will also increase your damage whether the enemy is affected by Hydro or Pyro. Now, once again, you're focusing mainly on making sure that the character is affected by Hydro or Pyro, because that's majorly what you're trying to do. You're trying to vaporize. So both of these instances, even if you're not vaporizing, Dragon's Bane will allow you to do more damage because of its ability. Never mind what the extra, buff from the EM from its main stat is going to do. Keep in mind, if you are going for a main stat of EM though, your crit is going to take a little bit of a dive, so make sure that you're focusing to make sure you have a good crit ratio, because the EM main stat is here. Now, a backup to these 2 weapons could be something like Deathmatch. It will increase your attack and defense if there are at least 2 or more enemies nearby. Also, if there are fewer than 2 opponents nearby, your attack will also then be increased by an even bigger amount. So if you're basically going against bosses, you're going to have a huge attack increase, which once again, Hu Tao does her damage based off of. So it's not a terrible weapon. Also, the same amount of, the idea of going into an idea with the crit rate with the main stat for a battle pass weapon. So it's the same as Battle of the Fjords in that sense. It's just not going into EM like it would be normally as well. But let's go further beyond basically looking at weapons and stuff like that. Let's go ahead and talk about artifacts. With Hu Tao, this depends on multiple things. Normally, and way back in the day, they would probably always be put on Crimson Witch of Flames, the 4-piece, because the 2-piece gives you a pyro damage bonus, and she already gets about 33% from her passive talent as well if you're keeping yourself under 50% HP. Also, the 4-piece states that it increases overload, burning, and burgeon damage by 40%. You don't care about that. What you care about is the increase to vaporize and melt damage by 15%. Also, when you're using your elemental skill, it will increase the 2-piece set bonus by 50% of its starting value for 10 seconds with a max of 3 stacks. Now, technically, this is actually supposed to be meant for Diluc, so this is, kind of the idea with him using his skill 3 times in a row. But Hu Tao does pretty well with this as well, because it's giving herself another 7.5% pyro damage bonus on top of already doing more vaporized damage more than normal for about 15%. So it is a pretty good 4-piece to actually look for and use for Hu Tao. And it was probably the reigning supreme kind of 4-piece set to really run with her for the longest time. And in my personal opinion, it still stays the same. Mainly when you're running Hu Tao, it's her with 2 other Hydro characters and a shielder, and mainly focusing on her doing charge attacks. Now, if you do have someone like Xianyun to actually focus on plunges, there's a different set that you're going to want to use, and that is Mère Chassé. The reason why is because you're increasing your damage based on your crit rate changing, going up and down. Now, usually what you'll do is you'll use Xianyun with Farina The reason why you're going to be using someone like Farina is because you don't have, like, Xingqiu and Yelan are not able to apply any hydro when you do plunges, only when you're doing normal attacks. And it works out with Hu Tao because with the polearm characters and some of the other weapons, you are doing a normal attack into your charge attack. So it immediately applies the idea of doing a normal attack when you're doing a charge attack already, so it kind of allows you to already kind of get that across. Now, the idea, once again, with this 4-piece set, though, is that as your HP changes, your increase to your crit rate is going to happen as well, meaning that you can get rid of a lot of the crit that you normally have, let's say getting rid of about 30%, so you can get the 36% from the actual set bonus. So if I was running that set, I'd probably be switching over to a crit damage circlet to allow myself the extra 36% that I already have from this set and give myself a little bit more from a different area. Basically, that's the entire idea with this, and it allows Farina to be pretty useful with you. Also, Hu Tao's changing her HP anyways as well. Now, that also does mean that someone like Xianyun is coming in there and healing. Now, you have someone like Hu Tao who decreases her HP, and Farina who's also decreasing HP. The issue is that hopefully you're staying under that 50% threshold, because Hu Tao is basically decreasing her HP, but Farina only decreases it up till the 50% threshold, and Hu Tao cannot unalive herself with her skill anyways, so if you are at like 10% HP and you use your skill, you'll get brought down to like nothing. You won't, croak. But that does mean that characters like Xianyun are going to be constantly bringing you a little bit over, because Xianyun's burst will be healing you, and Hu Tao, you want to make sure that your HP is staying below 50%. Or 50% or lower. So what Farina is going to be doing is keeping your HP at 50%, because Xianyun is going to be trying to increase it. Also, you'll be getting hit probably by enemies, so your HP will probably fall below the 50% threshold, which is fine anyways, but with the heals coming from Xianyun, you should be fine. And that's only 2 characters that you're really looking at right there. And Xianyun's most likely running a Viridescent, so you're getting a pretty good buff from there as well. There's a really good idea with running that team. Once again, if you are running that team, though, you're going to be focusing on a Maréchal 4-piece set instead of the 4-piece set probably that you're going to get from Crimson Witch of Flames. It's not to say that the Crimson Witch of Flames set does not work with the Plunge Hu Tao type team. It just means that it's not going to work as well, mainly because of someone like Farina. Now, looking a little bit further into kind of the idea with like kind of the main stats, looking at your Sands, your Goblet, and your Circlet, the Sands is mainly focusing on going into HP percent. You really shouldn't be going into anything else. I know she does go mainly into attack, but the buff that you get based off the HP percent into attack is going to be more useful for you. So getting something that has the HP percent main stat is going to do more for you. And I know that she gets a lot of pyro damage bonus from her, the 4-piece of the Crimson Witch of Flames, as well as she gets a, 33% from having less than 50% HP. So there's a really big buff from those other places, but I would still say that pyro damage bonus takes precedence most of the time anyways. Even if you wanted to go something into like HP percent or something like that, still pyro damage bonus is going to reign supreme for most players, as you can see here as well. Now, if you really, really want to, technically you can go into HP percent. If you had to choose between HP percent and attack, I'd rather you'd probably go into HP percent. But once again, going into HP percent might throw you over the threshold that you get from the attack increase maximum that you can only have. Once again, the entire idea is turning 5.66% of your max HP, this is at level 8, into attack. Now, if we take our max HP of 33,309, multiply that by 5.66%, we have 1,885 attack. The entire idea what that means is that my maximum that I can have, once again, I told you earlier, was 715, your base attack, times 400%, or times 4. Now, what that means is I can have around a maximum of 2,800 extra attack I can get. So if I go into any more HP percent, I mean, I'm still 1,000 off, so technically I should be still fine. But I really do think that it's really not necessary to really do that with your characters. Also, the pyro damage bonus is just going to go a pretty good way anyways, so I think that's why most players play it on both types of Hu Tao builds, usually anyways. Looking at substats, as you can see with most of my builds here, going into crit as well as into attack percent and EM is most likely the way to go. Technically, ER isn't terrible if you have a stat or two somewhere thrown in there, but it's really not something that you should be focusing on because she has a low energy cost anyways. Especially with most of her teams, you're shielding or you have outside healing and HP decreasing, so you shouldn't really be trying to use your burst very often anyways, unless you're trying to go for some sort of new Hu Tao, which that's a completely different build and a completely different idea. Looking beyond artifacts, let's go ahead and talk about Constellations. Her C1 is probably her best constellation because, as you saw when I'm using her skill over and over again with this idea, there's a constant idea of losing stamina over and over again. Now, it doesn't increase, your use of stamina, but just constantly using your stamina, you can only get some of these out before all of a sudden you have to just, and if you're at the point where you're just dodging, that's great and all, because as you saw right there, I ran out of my, my charge attacks. My charge attacks were fine. I didn't have any more infusion by the time I was done. The issue with all of that is that you have to do some sort of jump cancel to actually get the attack off before you actually do that, so that you're not using too much of your stamina, almost as you see there. And it's really still even not that great because you're still having to get rid of some. But the idea is that as you're getting these attacks off, you're either jump canceling or you're dash canceling. The idea with dash canceling though is that you're using up stamina. So the entire idea is there's a little bit of an annoyance, especially when you're trying to dodge enemies or something like that whenever they attack you. So with Hu Tao, using up stamina becomes a very big issue. So looking at the C1, it states that when you're in your skill state activated by your skill, Hu Tao's charge attacks do not consume any stamina. So when you're in that state, you won't consume stamina, which is going to help a lot. It'll allow you to dash, it'd be a little bit more comfortable with your Hu Tao. I would say that any Hu Tao haver, the C1 is borderline almost a must. Looking at the C2, it states that it increases the Blood Blossom damage of it by an amount equal to 10% of Hu Tao's max HP at the time of the effect being applied. Also, this is not really something I would say that really C2 isn't necessarily that great, but additionally, the Spirit Soother will also apply the Blood Blossom effect, which is her burst. Really, once again, you don't really see a crazy amount of damage coming out of this. It's just having that basically damage over time that you throw onto an enemy as soon as you tag them with the Blood Blossom when you do your skill and your charge attack on them. So it's not necessarily a terrible thing, it's some extra damage. It's just not something that you're going to see a really big damage increase from your Hu Tao from this. So the C2 isn't really necessarily that great in my personal opinion. The C3 increases the skill level by 3, and the C5 increases the level of the burst by 3. Looking at the C4, it states that upon defeating an enemy that was affected by the Blood Blossom effect that Hu Tao applied herself, all nearby allies in the party will have their crit rate increased by 12% for 15 seconds. We already saw that looking at her passive talent that the crit rate is increased for your party members if basically as soon as the skill state is done with Hu Tao, so the entire idea is getting more crit rate. So if you defeat enemies, which you're most likely going to be doing with Hu Tao, you're going to be getting about 27% crit rate as soon as she's done, meaning that other characters, as they're getting ready to set up, they have more crit rate for Favonius, like I stated earlier, or they can get some more damage out of their builds. Now looking at the C6, it states that it triggers when Hu Tao's HP drops below 25% or when she suffers a lethal strike. So this effect will happen whenever Hu Tao has lower than 25% HP or she's about to die. Hu Tao will not fall as a result of the damage sustained, and additionally for the next 10 seconds, her all elemental and physical resistance is increased by 200%, practically making her very, very difficult to kill even though she is at low HP. And her crit rate will also be increased by 100%, and her resistance to interruption is even more increased than it normally is. This effect triggers automatically when Hu Tao has 1 HP left and can occur once every 60 seconds. So this is happening once every minute if you really want to with your C6 Hu Tao. It also does a huge crit rate increase, which at that point, if I'm being honest with you, you just want to always stay below or around and below 25% HP because you're going to get a huge crit rate increase, which means you can just fully go into crit damage. I mean, you could sit with no crit rate on your build at 5% and go full blown into crit damage and allow yourself at C6 to be like a 100 over 300 or something crazy just because of what you can get from the C6. Now that does mean that you're probably going to be focusing on using a shielder like Zhongli, but if you have a C6 Hu Tao at this point, you're probably already running one of her best teams anyways. Speaking of looking at teams, let's go ahead and talk about teams that Hu Tao is going to be useful for and useful in. Now the entire idea I did talk about mainly with her best and major normal team that you're going to be running is Yelan and Hu Tao with some sort of shielder. Now you could throw in someone like Zhongli. Zhongli is going to probably be the best. That is the normal team that we saw back in the day. But with this idea, having two characters that are going to be helpful for hydro application with a character that is shielding is going to make sure that Hu Tao is doing the most damage. Yes, Layla can work in this instance because she'll be freezing the enemy, which will allow Hu Tao to actually melt, but Hu Tao can either melt or vaporize based on these characters, which will allow a little bit more consistency here. The reason why a lot of people like to use Zhongli, though, is because Zhongli doesn't get in the way of any of the reactions that are happening here, so he'll always make sure that Hu Tao's vaporizing. Also, once again, even though Yelan and Xingqiu are only applying because of normal attacks and Hu Tao discharge attacks, the initial, whenever you do a charge attack with one of these characters, you can see they kind of already do a normal attack first. So as soon as I do that, you can kind of see her swinging out first, and this is a regular normal attack. So she already does that like left to right slash, which is the normal attack, which means characters like Yelan and Xingqiu will also be able to do the extra kind of damage hit anyways when they're normally doing that anyways, meaning they'll apply the hydro for Hu Tao to then immediately come up and charge at them with her pyro, allowing her to vaporize. So never mind you're getting Yelan and Xingqiu damage as well as application, Hu Tao's coming in to vaporize, making everything work nice and dandy. And Zhongli kind of stays out of it by not taking really any of the application off because he's just providing a good shield. Layla, on the other hand, usually with her shield, she's throwing out some cryo at some point, so technically every once in a blue moon she might mess up the reaction, but normally from what I've seen it's not really too bad, but just keep that in mind as you are running that. The other team that I would say is useful and I did talk about was using Xianyun and Farina in the team as well. Now you can once again fill in your slot of, most likely my personal opinion, a shielder here because you don't still want to use Bennett. Someone else that could work also is someone like Toma. He's a pyro character who does have a shield as well, so if you want to go some sort of like idea with Toma shielding for Hu Tao, you could also use Tank Faye. A lot of people will run with one of her constellations. I believe she gets a shield, going a huge amount into HP. Do the same thing with Toma, just go a bunch into HP. The double pyro will allow the resonance for pyro, increasing attack a lot. Also, when you have double hydro on that other team, you're increasing max HP by 25%, which is helping Hu Tao. Yelan as well. Yelan's damage is based off HP. Hu Tao is going to turn more of that HP into attack, so that's pretty smart as well. In this team, though, having the double characters that are based off of attack in the sides, basically having two pyro characters, will allow Hu Tao to get a higher attack increase. Also technically helps Xianyun with her attack and healing. So in that idea, that is kind of the idea with this type of team. Once again, Toma can be switched out with a different character like Zhongli or Layla as well. But with this team, you're going to mainly be focusing on doing plunges rather than charge attacks. Now, this is a more expensive team technically because Xianyun is not really someone you'd normally be going after for most characters. Characters like Yelan and Zhongli are going to be pretty useful for a lot of characters because, well, they're just, pretty good for a lot of different teams. Xianyun, I'm not necessarily saying that she can't be used on a lot of teams because honestly, looking at plunge teams, you can kind of just make anyone plunge and do pretty well. Hu Tao just takes a very big, step forward because of it. So she's one of the best characters to go for plunge with Xianyun. Having Farina in there at the side allows Hu Tao to stay below that 50% threshold if she's getting hit pretty often. So the healing is going to be allowing things, if Farina is going to be allowing things. And if you really want, you want to switch out a different character to like Xilonen or something to make sure you're getting an even bigger buff. You have no elemental resonances here. You do have some extra resistance, which might allow Hu Tao to not be knocked around as much, meaning that she's not going to take as much damage. But having different elements might allow a little bit of a stronger buff here. Maybe throwing in Kazuha or something like that to have the double animo for some odd reason might be helpful as well to get the elemental damage bonus on Hu Tao. I think Shilonen's not a terrible idea to run either. And also, when you're looking at the other team, you could throw Xilonen or Kazuha in one of those teams as well. It's not going to necessarily be as good as the major teams that they're running, but it is a pretty solid team. And in this team, once again, you're focusing mainly with Hu Tao on doing plunging attacks. So the entire idea is to then use Xianyun's burst, have Hu Tao and have Farina's skill and burst going. Probably doing something with Hu Tao, probably using her burst maybe initially to immediately throw out her burst, apply some pyro, switch over to, Xilonen, have Xilonen immediately get the resonances or the resistance shred for pyro and hydro off for your characters, allowing Farina and Hu Tao to do more damage. Farina is going to be dropping HP, and obviously with her burst, she'll be giving a damage buff because of the HP changes in the team. Shilonen's a solid healer, so you'll probably be not using her kind of, you know, her healing too much, because you don't really want to make sure that Hu Tao is getting too much healing, because Xianyun's already doing plenty of that anyways. So that's the idea with this team. I would say most of the time that this team actually works pretty well. So it's actually a solid team. I think there are some pretty good usages to it, but I think this is definitely better for Hu Tao, you know, players that have like C0R1 or C0R0, so they don't have the weapon, but they don't have that first constellation. I think this team allows Hu Tao to still be pretty fun and usable, while also not having to worry about consistently worrying about making sure that I have to do charge attacks and have to watch my stamina, or doing, you know, charge attack, you know, normal attack canceling. There's none of that you have to worry about by jump canceling or whatever like that. So this team just allows, you know, Hu Tao to be fun again without having the C1. Well, that's everything I've got talking about Hu Tao in this video. If you guys did like the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe. Also, with this video, looking over at Hu Tao, let me know if you guys have any other thoughts, any other teams that you guys specifically wanted to kind of bring up. Mainly, I talked about one of her best teams, which is the double hydro kind of vaporized team, obviously throwing in someone with a shielder in that team. I know there's some other characters you could switch around with some of those characters, but that's kind of the major way to go about things. Also, with Hu Tao being on this plunge team, I know that's another extremely strong team, so I did want to talk about it. But if there was another team that you felt like that probably should have been talked about, please go ahead and let me know down in the comments for myself as well as other players as well. If you guys did like the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you guys